We'll hand them a script. This is your script. This is your role as the invader. We can control the narrative. And we get everybody focused on one thing. Do I have to explain the power of getting everybody to focus on one thing? Maybe I will for just a second. There's a tremendous amount of power getting everybody to focus on one thing. There, I explained it, all right? So if we get everyone focused, thank you. If we get everyone focused on one bad guy, that's a good thing. Right now, we probably have more groups, subgroups of people around the world who hate each other so bad that they have made it their entire goal of their life to eliminate another group. Or everybody else who's just not like them. Probably more so since, the 1800s. Probably more than at any other time in the 20th century. That represents a really serious problem. But if you get everyone to hate someone else, they just don't have enough hate in their heart for everybody. Okay? It becomes a limitation. If we have an extraterrestrial species that invades and becomes the bad guy, like the ultimate bad guy, that gets everybody else cooperating. Right? And as crazy as it might sound, if we can get Jews, Palestinians, Christians, Muslims, Sikhs, right-wing extremists, left-wing extremists, we can get all these people around the same campfire going, damn aliens. That's a good thing. Okay? That would be good. Now, we don't want it to stay that way forever, but we just want to get everybody's attention and get them to focus on one thing, one bad guy. What would be the criteria to be that bad guy? Anybody? Doesn't look like us. That's the number one. You want something that totally does not look like us. Something that is as foreign and alien to us as could be. Something that we see as more of an other than we would ever see anything else or have ever seen anything else. And something that would be easy for us to hate. Do we want them ugly?
Yeah.
If by our own standard of what's attractive or unattractive, beautiful or not, sure we do, right? We want them mean, ugly, completely unlike us, and with many, many, many expendable foot soldiers. Anybody want to take a guess on who that might be or what that might be? Rats, mice, no. Not bad, but...
Congress?
Hillary?
Insects? Do I hear a majority of people saying insects? Yes.
Hillary people.
Insects. Spiders are arachnids. They're not insects.
Snakes.
And while they do represent a thing that many people are afraid of, because a lot of people have arachnophobia, it just turns out that there aren't enough evolved arachnid species for us to get one of them to play that part. So arachnids are off the table.
Snakes.
Snakes, reptiles, serpents, maybe. But we don't necessarily want to start people off thinking that all reptiles are bad. We have a lot of friends who are reptiles that we trade with that are actually pretty nice.
Oh.
Does it surprise anybody that there's actually good reptiles?
Yes.
Yeah.
It shouldn't surprise you, how very speciesist of you to think that all reptiles are bad. Very speciesist. What, you think they all look alike? You think they're all the same? No, not at all. Just because we have had one really bad reptile in our history that has given us a lot of trouble, doesn't mean they're all bad. Just gonna start with that. So I would suggest that while this is not etched in stone, it's probably gonna be insects. All right? Yes, ma'am.
Who's the really bad reptile?
The draconians are the really bad reptile, for those of you who don't know who I was talking about.
And Princess Diana used to say that the royal family were shape-shifting reptilians. Do you know anything about that?
They're not. They're descendants of a lot of interbreeding with those reptiles. But most of them are not shapeshifters. Most of them have lost their shapeshifting ability that their ancestors may have had. So most of them are not. Most of them are long lost, related, bastard children who have been put into positions of authority because they're related. But most of them have lost their shape-shifting ability. That doesn't mean that some of them don't have it, but most of them actually have lost their shape-shifting abilities. They're not much more of a reptile, to be honest, than most of us are, because we all have sort of reptilian DNA in us, right? They're not much more of a reptile than you or I am, but because some of their DNA has been attempted to keep in a discrete line of descension, is why they're a little bit more reptile than you and I are. Why they're more in the position of being the toady of some higher up reptilian species. In this case, we're still talking about the draconians. But for those of you who don't know, I'll be very clear about this. The draconians just aren't the problem that they used to be. They're just not. Their numbers have been way reduced on planet Earth. Their space fleets have been way reduced or chased off. They're just not that much of a threat. There was a time, I would say a couple of decades ago, when it became very clear that they were one of the major problems that we had. And so we began to take it upon ourselves as a intergalactically capable space force to start to eliminate them. And that was a little bit of a rough start, but started to work better and better and better. And let's just say that their egomaniacal, pompous attitude kept them in the fight longer than they should have. If they were smart, they would have left a long time ago. But they kept thinking to themselves, we're undefeatable! While they were getting their asses kicked. So at some point, they're not much of a problem anymore. That's not to say that we don't have pockets of them, but they also have their own groups of dissension, right? So there are different draconians that have different agendas. So most of the corporatist draconians, who are the green ones, not so much of a problem. There are some white ones, some people might have heard of the white Dracos, who do participate in some covert military space program activities, specifically with the Nachtwaffen, or the German fleet, the New Schwabenlanders fleet. Do we know what I'm talking about when I talk about them? Yes, no?
No.
No. All right, I heard a no, I'll be super quick about this. So New Schwabenland is a little piece of territory in Antarctica that was founded in the 1930s and claimed by Nazi Germany. When Germany on paper lost the war, those who fled to Antarctica fled to New Schwabenland. So they stopped being Germans on paper and they became New Schwabenlanders. So when they were covertly entered into the United Nations registrar, when sort of the peace agreement between the second armistice from sort of World War IV was worked out in the 50s, because they attempted to continue to use their advanced technology to muscle the rest of the world to do what they wanted to do, but they just didn't have the manpower to do it. Not having the manpower to do it meant that eventually they had to still make a peace agreement with everybody else, and at that point they became the New Schwabenlanders. And so when the New Schwabenlanders started their space fleet they call themselves the Nachtwaffen, which means night fleet, or also what most people understand is called the dark fleet. Okay, so they have white Dracos who are working with them, and from people I know who have served with them, they're not as horrible as their cousins, and they have more honor and more integrity, and so they more often keep their word, so they can be trusted a little bit better. I have my own biases and prejudice against them, so without me being too much of a speciesist, I still don't trust a draconian as far as I can, any farther than I can throw one, and I can't throw too many of them too far. So they're not my best friends, but there are some people here on planet Earth and within our fleet that still work with them. So again, not everybody's, even people that we work with sometimes aren't great, aren't awesome, but they're not so horrible that we can't work with them, right?
I have a question.
Yes.
What is their agenda?
With the Draconians, period?
Like, I think it's those people, those groups.
Like the Nachtwaffen, you mean the New Schwabenlanders? Well, how can I sum this up? Nazis are assholes.
Right.
So, right? So that's pretty much their agenda. They're assholes. And they would love still to have a day when they get to be completely in charge and that they can say that they dominate across the space fleet, and they're like, they have this long-term plan to rule the world. It's not something they're giving up anytime soon, right? So, and we know this, we always know this, and even when they try and pretend, we're not trying to take over the world, like we know that that's, right, we know that that's their long-term agenda.
Basically, Cape is not just this planet, it just wants to, conquer for the other area. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, they're still subscribing to a belief system which is fascist eugenics based, right? Which is they want to dictate the entire flow of genetic breeding and the flow of genetic evolution from here to the future, and they would like to do so in an incredibly fascist way, because that's basically what they believe in.
It just sounds like it's a Star Wars, dark side.
As above, so below. Right? So it turns out that many of the conflicts that we understand that come from our science fiction is a lot more factually based in what's happening out there with our friends and neighbors. Okay. So, all right, so let's get to the fun part. So we're already at buggies, giant insects. Okay, right, we got that far. If you have a scenario where you have many ships, thousands of them, descend upon the planet, giant bugs start swarming out of the gates of said ships and start attacking people and biting their heads off and turning cars over and vaporizing buildings. That gets everybody's attention really focused.
Yep.
Really focused. Really focused. It also creates a desperate life or death need. Right? So one of the problems we have with how do we get the technology that we have released, it's convincing the people that have certain control over that technology that they should release it. And without a life-threatening, life or death need, many of them are just, well, not this year, maybe next year, maybe the year after that. We're thinking about it. We're working on some civilian model of that technology that we're willing to release sometime in the next decade. But if you have a life-threatening, life or death immediate need, that technology is going to show up a lot sooner. Okay? Now, what are some things that we're going to need if we're facing an invasion by giant insects? Bug spray. Chemical agents. Chemical agents that kill insects, absolutely. But you have to be careful spraying large quantities of sprays that kill insects, especially when they're in cities where there's lots of people. And people, turns out, we kind of die at most bug sprays as well. So if you don't ever try this at home, but if you were to take a bug spray, just spray it in your face, like it might kill you too. Right? So don't do that. Don't. But I'm telling you, it's not necessarily a good thing. But we're going to need things that kill bugs, right? We have some things now that kill bugs, but we don't have nearly enough of them. Oh, don't get me started. You're ahead of me. You're ahead of me. You're just a little bit ahead. I haven't got to the giant Japanese robot yet. I'll get there. So we're going to need spaceships that can fight. They're spaceships, right? We're going to need things that cut through exoskeletons fairly quickly, right? We're going to need hardware that protects our people. We're going to need things that make us stronger, right? Anybody know what an exosuit is? Yeah, okay, all right. Exosuit is a hydraulically powered external thing that you step into or that you wear that essentially allows you to have superhuman strength, right? So if just
Spider-Man.
Iron Man.
Oh yeah.
Avatar.
Okay.
Avatar, right? Those are exosuits. So if you want to, just for fun, later on, you can Google Raytheon exosuit, and you will see what the military contractors are telling you that they're developing and they're working on. I guarantee the stuff that we have is way better, right? But if you want to at least see an example of what a semi-functional prototype looks like, just like look at what the Raytheon is building right now. And mostly what they're doing is they say, they have a power problem, which is, having a micro power pack attached to it, so you've got like a long cord attached to it, so it's sort of limited in how they test them. And they're mostly testing them with soldiers lifting heavy objects for tremendous periods of time, but they're way cooler what we have than that. So we're going to need all that stuff, right? We have all that stuff. Do we have enough of it? No. We're going to need a lot more. Because we can't all of a sudden start taking the stuff that we're selling to other planets, other intergalactic species. That's part of our trade contract. That's money. We can't just say, oh, let's take some of the stuff that we're selling to the Andromedans next week and use that for our own war effort. It's not going to work. So we're going to need to start our own manufacturing based here on Earth. Would anyone like to see our industrial base revitalized?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Because making stuff matters, right? I mean, with another conversation about macroeconomics, making stuff matters. Having an industrial base matters. Being able to build things matter. Well, if you have an immediate need, life-threatening, life or death need for advanced technology that you're going to have to start building lots of to supply a war effort, I don't think there's anybody probably old enough to remember what it was like to go through World War II.
Yeah.
Anybody? Oh, I'm sorry, Preston, I forgot about you. So, but those of you who remember your history lessons, remember that needing to produce all those tanks, all those planes, all that hardware, all that ammunition, gave our industrial base a shot in the arm that made our economy thrive. Would we like to see the economy thrive?
Yeah.
Would we like to see our industrial base rebuilt and thriving?
Yes.
Would we like to see the advanced technology that we know is just over here somewhere behind the wall that we can't get access to all of a sudden be out in the open?
Yes.
Okay, so now you're starting to understand my point when I say hoax invasion good. Right? Fixes the economy, revitalizes the industrial base, gets the advanced technology that we already have that we need out in the open much faster, much sooner. gets us from being on the edge of being a 21st century advanced civilization, which we are, right? When you think about what we have, when you think about the fleet as it is. But as far as what everybody gets to participate in, not quite yet, right? But we want that. We want to get everybody participating. So if we get that all out in the open and everybody's participating, then we're only one step away from getting everybody involved in the intergalactic trade process. Right? So right now you have certain import-exporters whose job it is to fulfill these contracts, these intergalactic trade contracts. If we just do away with the glass ceiling of disclosure, we get rid of that, we're just this far away from you being able to decide that you want to export, I don't know, pencils. Nobody uses pencils anymore, but let's just say that there are some species that still like to write on paper, and we can make a cheaper pencil than they can. And you want to export pencils. Right, that's a terrible example, but good show. I couldn't think of something off the top of my head, so I had to go with whatever you shouted out. So appreciate that. So we want these things to happen. Now, let's talk about some of the negatives, because there will be a few negatives. Yeah, casualties, collateral damage. Yeah, that's going to be a downside. Because you can't have a hoax invasion, or an invasion period, without people dying. Now, militarily, there's a very simple way that we have to look at this. And I will quote from one of my favorite movies of all time, Dr. Strangelove. Anybody seen Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove? It's like one of my favorite movies of all time. I love that movie. So George C. Scott, who plays General Buck Turgidson in the movie, is having a conversation with the President of the United States about possible outcomes. And he lays out just the essence of what military-minded thinking is about. And he says, Mr. President, we have two post-war scenarios. One where we have 25 million dead, and another where we have 150 million people dead. Sometimes you just have to do that hard math. And sometimes when you're looking at a scenario where 5 billion people are going to die from civil war, infighting, starvation, ecological disaster, or you have another scenario where only 1 billion people die, you're going to go with the plan where only 1 billion people die. All right? It's not fun. It's not pleasant to have to look at those numbers and pick. But in any situation, military men, we are taught one thing, and that is to be willing to sacrifice fewer lives to save more. Anytime that's an option. If I was the captain of a ship, and the ship was going to sink unless I sent 10 guys into an area that was on fire to repair something, where I knew that most of them are not going to come back, would I sacrifice 10 men's lives to save 2,000? In a heartbeat. In a heartbeat. I would not even hesitate to do that. So when we're talking about this scenario, when we're looking at the potential of people dying from a hoax invasion, it's going to be less people that are going to die if we just let things go. Okay? So it's not going to be pleasant. It's not something that I'm looking forward to in that sense. I'm not looking forward to a bunch of people dying. But if the option is some people die or a lot more people die, I'm going to be like, you know what, I'm okay with this over here where fewer people die. Especially if it's places where, can we just be honest, they kind of suck, right? I mean, some of the largest cities around the world, if you've ever been to any of them. Anyone been to New York City recently? Hong Kong recently, London recently, Singapore. Anybody been to one of these really big, overburdened cities recently? It's a mess. It's an absolute mess. And there are only so many ways that you're going to fix that mess. And some of the ways that you fix that mess is with a lot of destruction. And then with a lot of rebuilding. So once again, when we're talking about things that fix infrastructure or rebuild the economy, when this is all said and done, when the war is over, and you've got so many buildings, bridges that are absolutely turned to rubble or powder, well, we're going to have to rebuild. And there's a lot of these cities that need new infrastructure. They need brand new infrastructure. And it's not going to happen unless you break the infrastructure that they have. And again, this is difficult for me as a person to say, yeah, because it's like, oh, it's going to suck so bad. It's going to suck so bad. If you live in one of those cities. Anybody think that's going to suck for us here in Yelm? No. Because we don't matter. Okay? Strategically, as far as locations which are strategically important for someone conducting an invasion, we don't matter. We are also nestled between two military bases. Right? So we're not exactly the top priority. We're pretty good here. There's a lot of other places that you'd be pretty good. And I would suggest, those of you who have friends and family in some of these cities, if you were to tell them tomorrow, I just listened to this guy talk about alien invasion, it's not going to be real, but people know where they die, you need to get out of the city right now. Any of you think you got friends and relatives that want to hear that?
No.
So, tell them whatever you want. If you're not already that person in the family, which I know most of you are, and you want to just like let everybody in the family think you've completely lost your mind, by all means, pick up the phone and tell them, get out now, right? Because it's probably going to be the safest thing for them to do is to not be there. Because when it happens, it's going to be the biggest traffic jam in the world, and there are people that you're just not going to be able to get out, and they're going to be stuck there, and it's going to go down just however it's going to go down. It's going to kind of suck. But
So Randy, how do you get the volunteers of the invading species to give up their lives to come in?
easy peasy. Easy peasy. So first of all, we're talking about insects. So they can hatch as many eggs as they need.
Oh my God.
Okay. 2, they have collective consciousness. Right? So when one insect dies, it immediately, its spirit consciousness that habitates that body goes right back into the collective consciousness, and then gets hatched out in another egg. So no one's really going to die on their side. If you want to put it to another metaphysical level, what's going to happen to the people on our side? Well, they're going to die and then get reincarnated. Right? I mean, so it's going to be a big recycling effort. Okay? Not without its, like I said, its minuses. But it's pretty easy to get an insectoid species to agree to that because they're not really going to suffer losses. And they can hatch out eggs like you wouldn't believe. They're like, well, we're going to need you to hatch out like 20 million eggs. And they're like, all right, we can do that.
Are they AI?
Insectoids?
Yes.
Artificial intelligence? No.
Okay.
No. Most of the insectoid species that we are friends with are biological insects, biological beings who experience collective consciousness. That's what being an insect is, hive mind. Okay?
Randy, can they target the cabal and just eat them instead?
Oh, isn't that a good question she
What did you
asked?
say?
So the question she asked is, can't they just target the cabal and get rid of them? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. So let's just say giant bugs attack, giant bugs land in major cities. Oh, and a few secret military bases get vaporized in the process. And maybe it's just ones that we want to get vaporized. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
So the answer to that is basically they can assist with the cleansing of our own house. This gives us also an opportunity to do a tremendous amount of internal house cleaning.
Yay.
Okay? Lets us get rid of a few holdouts of some people who otherwise don't want to play nice with everybody else. Yes, go ahead.
You said that, would you rather have a few people die rather than a few million? What's the scenario where a lot of people die? You said.
That's if we don't do anything.
Why?
Collapse. In industrial civilized collapse. Essentially what will happen if I said to this room that we are as close to being on the verge in this country of going to Civil War 2.0 as we were before the Civil War, would anybody be surprised to hear that?
No.
Okay. If you are surprised to hear that, it's because you live in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah,
If you lived in Texas, one of the Carolinas, Florida, Kentucky, Oklahoma, these are places where this would not be a surprise to you at all.
What?
Because you would be hearing people talk about it all the time. Right? You would hear this message and this conversation a lot. And so if you listen to the news at all, depending on who or what you might want to listen to, this conversation goes around a little bit. But we are as close to blowing up into civil war in this country as we ever have since the first Civil War.
Wow.
Already?
Oh yeah, very close. We've been very close we have been getting closer and closer and closer for the past 5 years, right? Close enough that we would like to do any number of things to avoid that, because an internal collapse, an internal civil war would be more devastating at this stage in our development than anything else that we could think of. But when you start to have food shortage problems, when you start to have technological failure of everything that we have that works, when we finally run out of petroleum products, finally run out of oil, finally run out of gasoline, right? When we start to experience the social, civil, cataclysmic, environmental issues that are all happening right now. The oceans will rise. Florida will no longer exist at some point. Okay, that's going to happen. We are approaching a world of no ice, right? Where all the ice is gone. And I guarantee you once all the ice is gone, the water will go up quite a bit. And the number of people that will die from that and have to relocate, the number of people that will starve in that process, and the number of people who will kill each other and eat each other in that process will descend us down a spiral that will be very difficult to get back up from. One that will take decades or centuries. Okay? So we want to avoid that. We want to avoid all of these trepidatious things from just going into collapse, because the cascade effect of those things will just get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, unless you do something before all of that happens to divert that. So a situation in where some people die, some cities have to get rebuilt, we get to revitalize the industrial base, we get to bring advanced technology into our world, into the civilian world, is a more pleasant scenario than the other one. Now I will say this, before I think, do we know what time it is? I'm probably going to take a break soon here.
Yes, 10 to 9.
You okay?
About.
We're going to take a break here soon. My Brigadier General has said to me, he said, look, if we're 5 minutes before go time on Hoax Invasion Plan B. We're 5 minutes away. And all of a sudden, something happens that we end up on Plan A. We're not going to be disappointed. Oh, shucks. No Hoax Invasion. Like, we're not going to be disappointed. We're just going to be like, well, all right, now we have a different mess to deal with. It's two different messes, two different kinds of chaos. But if we manage them, it's better than the chaos that will ensue if we do nothing. Okay? So we're not really super duper like, yeah, let's have Hoax Invasion, that's the best possible thing ever. But it just turns out to be the thing that's most likely because, again, at that table where we're discussing with people on what do you want to do, Plan A or Plan B, more people agree Plan B than Plan A. The majority of the people at this table are like, Hoax Invasion? Okay, let's do it. Let's make it happen. Now, where we're at right now with that table is we have about 60% in agreement. 60%. That's significant. That means we're only about 15 or 20% away from go. Once we get to 75 or 80%, it's happening. The last 20, 25% is just going to have to play along or have a terrible accident, fall down a flight of stairs, or get pushed out of a window, or get in a car accident, or a plane crash, or, die under mysterious circumstances. That's just kind of how it's going to go, right? If even you've got some of those holdouts are like, no, like once you've got 75, 80%, it's happening. So we're at 60% now, which is a leap. We were at 55% just after the holidays. So we've jumped another 5% in just a matter of weeks. At that rate, we could get to 75, 80% pretty quickly. And once we get to that point is when you're no longer going to be having the discussion, what are we doing, how are we doing it? Then the discussion is when. So it's always tricky when people start to talk about dates or predictions, right? I've never, ever, ever liked to be the person to try and tell people when we think a disclosure event is going to happen, what's coming down the road, because there's always just been this, well, anytime between now and, 2023, 2024, something like that. But I would suggest, with what we're seeing now, we could see this plan go later this year or by 2020 at the earliest. Obviously, it could still be after that, but it could be this year, next year. Like, it could be soon. So part of why I'm having this discussion is so that we can all be a little mentally and psychologically prepared. Some of us are already a little physically prepared. Most people in this town probably have got, some food stores for an event, for an emergency. But being mentally and emotionally and psychologically prepared is very important. Now, I say we don't want to prefer an alien invasion over a take me to your leader option. It just sort of works out on paper that one is less of a logistical mess if you're the military, right? I'm not saying it's more or less of a logistical mess for everybody else, but I'm saying as a military organization, we understand combat. We understand war. We understand how to both do that for real and how to do it for pretend. We understand that very well. We understand the variables really well. We understand the nuts and bolts of that very well. That's a lot easier for us to manage than it is this other process. But mostly, it's not us saying, well, we can manage this better, so let's do that. Mostly, we have left that discussion around the table to be like, well, what do you guys want to do? And when we lay out on paper what we understand can happen A or B, you start to get a majority of people saying, well, I'm going for Hoax Invasion because it works out better for them too. Most of the people at that table, when they look at option A or option B, see that option B works better for them. So that's why we're there. Doesn't mean it's the only possibility, doesn't mean it's the only thing that can happen, but it does mean why we're there. Now, the one exception, and I feel a teeny bit guilty to say this, just a teeny bit, just a teeny bit. Because my inner 14-year-old really, really, really wants to see the Hoax invasion. For one reason. For one reason only. Okay. It's not because I want to watch cities burn and die. I don't want to watch that. It's not because I want to watch giant bugs run down the street biting people's heads off. I don't want to watch that. It's not going to be too much fun to watch. I do, however, want to see the giant Japanese robot. I want to see that so bad. I'm admitting it, but I feel a little guilty, right? Because I want to see that happen. And if we go Hoax Invasion, we will see the giant robot. It will happen. Anybody heard me talk about the giant robot before?
No.
I know, I've talked about this a little bit, but if you haven't heard me. Okay, so, anybody ever seen a Japanese cartoon? Read a Japanese comic book? Seen a Japanese monster movie?
No, tell me about something I don't know.
Yes, thank you. Yoshiko knows. She's from Japan. So if any of you have seen a cartoon, read a comic book, seen a Japanese monster movie, you will understand that there is a theme, a common thread throughout all of these things. And that is giant robots. Gundam.
Yeah.
Gundam's what they call them in Japan. As a culture, as a society, as their own corner of civilization on planet Earth, the Japanese want to see giant robots more than anything. This is a culture that has lived since the 1950s, dreaming about giant robots. Putting it into every futuristic science fiction theme that they can come up with, giant robot. Giant robot, giant robot, giant robot. They want it so bad. And I guarantee they've been working on it. I guarantee they've been working on it. I guarantee they got a working model. I guarantee they got a 95-foot giant robot that works. Okay? Now, a couple years ago, as we were understanding that they were near completion with this project, we weren't 100% sure what it was going to look like. We knew that there was some decision-making in the process that was still working itself out. We weren't sure. Essentially, it was going to go one of two ways. Mechagodzilla or giant samurai warrior, like Gundam, right? We knew that that hadn't been decided. It's been decided. They're going with giant Gundam samurai warrior. And apparently, they have built a sword for this giant robot. Can you imagine the size of a sword that a 95-foot samurai gets to wield?
Cool.
Don't you want to see that slice through an alien spaceship just once? I do. I want to see that so bad. I feel a little teeny bit guilty that I want to see that happen, but I do. I don't want to see people getting their heads bitten off. I don't want to see New York City turn to a cinder. Maybe Los Angeles, but, you know, what's the loss, right? But what I really want to see is the giant robot. Am I a bad person for wanting to see the giant robot?
No.
I don't know. I don't know if it makes me a good person or a bad person. I'm just admitting a personal truth to you. I want to see the giant robot. That's the only thing I'm looking forward to. If we go Hoax Invasion, giant robot. That would be lovely. So, plenty good, plenty of bad. And there's plenty more for me to say about this, as well as I'm sure answer questions that we're going to have in the second half of this chit-chat that we're having here tonight. But I think we're going to call this halftime, and we're going to take a break. So, thank you very much for listening to the first half. So, quick review. So we've essentially established there's a group of everybody that's in the process of deciding what we're going to do as a planet. We got two options: take me to your leader, invasion. We've talked about some of the logistical problems of take me to your leader. We've discussed a little bit about why the majority of people seem to agree that invasion's a good idea. We've talked a little bit about the pros and cons of that, especially when we talk about revitalization of infrastructure, revitalization of manufacturing base, moving us from one state of technological understanding in the civilian world to another threshold of technological understanding in the civilian world. We get just completely beyond the idea that we're alone in the universe. All of a sudden we fully understand and are aware that we're not alone in the universe. We have, at least at first, we understand we have an enemy. But what about our friends? What about our friends? So, when I say the word melodrama, does anybody understand the origination of the melodrama?
No.
Jane, how come I don't see your hand up? You're a theater person. You understand what melodrama is. All right, so classic melodrama is a theatrical technique. It's a genre of theater. Okay? And it's a very simple genre of theater. There's a good guy who wears a white hat. That's where we get the term white hat. There's a bad guy who wears a black hat and usually twirls his mustache and goes a lot. And there's usually a damsel in distress that's involved, and the black hat guy is almost always trying to kidnap and or convince the girl, the damsel in distress, that she has to marry him to save the farm or whatever. And the hero, the guy in the white hat, comes along and says, "I'll save you," and then he saves them. So melodrama is this very specific type of theater, very specific. So in this case, we're talking essentially about a pattern of melodrama. So we've established who the bad guy is going to be, right? That's going to be some giant insects. What about the good guy? Who gets to play the part of the good guy? Right? So, after some, let's just say months, it's an undecided period of time at this point, depends on a lot of logistical issues that will just be sorted out as this occurs. So from day one invasion until we get to the entrance of the hero with the white hat entrance stage left will be so many months. Could be longer than a year, but probably not going to be much longer than that if we go that far. 18 months, I think, is about the top that we would probably go from invasion to entrance of the hero, who gets to be one of our other intergalactic neighbors and friends, who gets to show up to help and say, "I see that you have a problem with a hostile invading species, and you need my help. So I'm going to show up and help." And then the white-hatted extraterrestrial species shows up and says, "Well, while I see that you have now started to use this advanced technology, this advanced technology, and this advanced technology, I have other technologies that will help you in this fight. We can help you in this fight." So they can introduce a number of other things technologically, sociologically, into our realm, including that now not only do we have bad guys, we have good guys. So then in the collective consciousness, we can, in this very primitive mind that we have, let's not forget that we, even though some of us in this room may have been working very, very hard most of our lives to advance the development of our minds, we must understand that as human beings, as a species, we're still very primitive. And most of our friends and family and neighbors and people that we have to live with are also very primitive. maybe it helps if I break it down like this. 100 IQ is average. Okay? So on the chart, what this means is, right down the middle, 100 IQ, which means about 50% of the population is smarter than that, and the other 50% of the population is dumber than that.
Oh, yeah.
So you're starting to see the problem now? Okay, it's not the 50% of people who are above 100 that are the problem when it comes to trying to get people to understand things or cooperate or see the light of day or have an evolved emotion or thought about something. It's that 50% that's under 100. That's the problem. Because quite literally, they lack the brain power to do the computations, to figure out what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong. And so they're not left to often the ability to figure things out with their brains. They have to figure things out with their guts. What they feel here. And what you feel here is not always right. It's not always factually correct. But we can use the things we understand about human psychology and human behavior to guide that instinctual turn of the guts to go the direction that we want it to go instead of going the direction we don't want it to go. So it is less a problem to think about what are the people on the top side of that scale going to do than it is to figure out what do we want to avoid the people on the bottom of that scale doing. So we know from, and when I say recent history, let's just talk about the last 100 years, that it is a very possible thing for a group of people who have a strict belief system to decide to commit mass suicide. We know that sometimes they will do it by poison. Sometimes they will do it by locking themselves in a building and burning the whole building to the ground. These are not things that might happen. These are things that have happened. People have done this already. It's happened. So when we think about potentialities where we want to avoid this kind of thing from happening again, we don't have to speculate whether it might happen, because we know that it has happened. We can almost guarantee that it's going to happen again under the right circumstances. So one of the things that we definitely want to mitigate is a trend. Oh, yeah, come on, sit down. You're not interrupting me. It's fine. We want to mitigate mass suicide. We want to mitigate a whole bunch of people losing their shit and deciding that they need to lock themselves in a building and burn themselves to the ground so they can go be with God, because they think that's the only option. We want to avoid that. We think, on paper, that if everyone is focused on a common enemy, that's less likely to happen. Because people will be more focused on the fight of their survival than they will be on alternatives to living in a reality that they don't, want to live in. Because that would be the reason that people would kill themselves en masse. I don't want to live in this reality. I don't want to live in a world where there's giant bugs and these many hundreds of other species, and all of a sudden my universe has become so big it makes my brain just go, right? I just can't comprehend something that big. And so we know that a certain amount of those people are going to freak the fuck out. It's just going to happen. It's just going to happen. It's unavoidable. Unavoidable. Plan A, Plan B, they're going to freak the fuck out. What we want to hope is that we can guide that process so fewer of them kill themselves, kill their family members, or kill other random people. So controlling the narrative gives us an opportunity to do that. So convincing people that they need to focus and fight on a common enemy gives less room in their brain for why they need to kill themselves. Does that make sense to people?
Yeah.
Okay. So we don't want mass suicides. We don't want people drinking poison. We don't want them burning themselves down in buildings. We don't want them jumping off of cliffs. We don't want whatever plan that they want to think of to do that. So we want to mitigate that as much as possible. The two ways that we mitigate that are, again, having a focus on a common enemy. Two, by getting to that 85% acceptance of the population as quickly as we can. This is again one of the logistical problems of Take Me to Your Leader, is Take Me to Your Leader can take more than 6 months to get to 85% acceptance. That's a long time when you're thinking about what can go wrong in that 6 months. Hoax Invasion, we get to 85% acceptance in as early as 14 days. And in his maximum amount of time is about 90 days. So instead of waiting 6 months, it's going to be anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months. And then we've got 85% acceptance. And the beautiful part about that is that 15% that still doesn't want to be in acceptance, once you get to 85%, they at least give up thinking fatalistically. So they'll sit at home, stare at their computers or their TVs and go, no, I don't like this at all, not one bit. No, don't like it. Hey, don't disagree. I disagree with it. I don't like it. But they're not going to do anything about it. They're not going to do anything crazy. They're not going to kill themselves. They're not going to kill their family. They're not going to get together with a bunch of people and all commit mass suicide. They're just going to shake their heads and go, crumble, 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 which is preferable. So we would rather they complain and sit at home and shake their fists at the television and throw things at the TV than actually do something that could end their lives or the lives of their friends or family members. Anybody understand why that's a good idea? Just nod yes, okay, I understand, right. So, now let's get back to the good guy. Who gets to play the part of the good guy? We talked a little bit about